Tracing the arc of American exceptionism for India. The growth of the relationship between India and the United States is often traced from its nadir 25 years ago, when the US imposed sanctions against India and Pakistan, after they tested their nuclear weapons in May 1998. Since then the arc of the relationship between India and America has grown year on year, some years more than others, built by 5 American presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and 3 Indian Prime Ministers, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Manmohan Singh, Narendra Modi, over the first 2 decades of the 21st century. While the Clinton-Vajpayee era gave impetus to summit-level diplomacy in the relationship, the Manmohan-Bush and Manmohan-Obama relationship highlighted nuclear diplomacy, and Modi-Obama and Modi-Trump worked on trade and military diplomacy. After his visit to Washington in earlier this June, Mr. Modi's meetings with Mr. Biden during his state visit to Washington have led to the 2 nations forging ahead with technology diplomacy, including the unprecedented new promise of transfer of technology, TOT, from the US as a result of the Memorandum of Understanding between General Electric, GE, Aerospace and Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL, to produce fighter jet engines for the Indian Air Force. For India, the rapidly rising arc of ties has been seen in terms of shrugging off what Mr. Modi in 2016 called the hesitations of history and of renouncing the government's Cold War muscle memory in Indian foreign policy towards the US. The more important arc, however, is the shift in the US's belief in American exceptionalism, to a more pragmatic era of American exceptionism for India. In other words, it is the US's decision to make a series of exceptions specifically for India in the first quarter of this century that has been responsible for the big surges in a relationship billed as the most defining partnership of the century by Mr. Obama, 2009, and Mr. Biden, 2023. The Civil Nuclear Deal. In 1998, just 6 months after the US imposed sanctions on India mandated by the Arms Export Control Act, in November, Mr. Clinton signed a waiver to the sanctions on both India and Pakistan. The Bush administration's push for civil nuclear exemptions resulted in the India-US joint statement in 2005, a waiver under the Non-Proliferation Act, the Henry Hyde Act and the 123 Agreement with India, which also led to an India-specific exemption at the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2008. The Obama visit to Delhi in 2010 saw a breakthrough in implementing all the waivers of the previous decade to make another set of exceptions for India on export controls and high-technology trade and transfers under the U.S. Export Administration Regulations, EAR, and International Traffic in Arms Regulations, ITAR. The significance of all these exceptions was that they were made despite the fact that India never joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation (NPT) treaty regime, nor did it sign the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. More importantly, these were India-specific waivers not available to other non-NPT countries such as Pakistan, and were crucial indicators of the shift in U.S. alignment in South Asia. The Russian angle. Over the past decade, the US's waivers have been on regulations dealing with Russia, such as the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, SASA, of 2017. The Trump administration avoided sanctioning India for the Russian S-400 missile system, but sanctioned Turkey and China for the same purchases. In 2022, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Ro-Khanna Amendment, which if made law, would exempt India entirely from SASA sanctions. In the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine, the U.S. has ruled out secondary sanctions against India for its considerable oil imports or defense engagement from Russia. This is indeed an exception, given that Mr. Biden ordered sanctions in 2022 on even German entities for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Finally, there are the International Religious Freedom Act exemptions the U.S. has accorded India for the past 4 years. Despite repeated recommendations from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom to place India on a list of countries of particular concern which includes China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Myanmar, the State Department has not complied. It is pertinent to note all these exceptions have been made for India, despite its disavowal of ever becoming an ally, or alliance partner, and in spite of its strong ties with US adversaries such as Russia and Iran. The exceptions have come without India accepting conditionalities on cutting ties with these adversaries, withdrawing from groupings such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, that pose a challenge to the US-Europe world order, or of any commitments to join US military operations against them. And they have been granted even though very few commercial contracts have fructified for US companies, nuclear power plants, fighter jets, weapons systems, thus far. A perspective. Why has the US institutionalized such a broad-based waiver policy for India over 2.5 decades? The first reason is obviously the promise of ties with India, the world's most populous nation, that has been an inclusive, pluralistic democracy for most of its history as a republic with a record in non-proliferation. Where there are concerns on these issues, the US calculation is that expressing them is unproductive. In Mr. Obama's contentious interview to CNN last week, he said that he dealt with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Mr. Modi on the Paris Climate Accord despite concerns on authoritarianism, due to their size. Second, there is India's attractiveness as an economic market and a military buyer. Third, there is India's geography in Asia, and its boundary problems from Beijing, that could make it a more dependable partner than European allies in providing a counter to China. Fourth, both Mr. Biden and Mr. Modi acknowledged the Indian-American diaspora, that has distinguished itself as a professional, law-abiding, prosperous and unproblematic community, and is the biggest votary of better India-US ties. Paradoxically, the biggest challenges to this relationship's untrammeled arc lie precisely in the mechanism used to strengthen it, the exceptions made for India, which can be reversed at any time. Former close partners of the US, such as Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and even China, today complain about the fickleness of American foreign policy towards them. Second, despite India's growth story, the relationship remains largely one-directional on issues such as investment, hardware or technology transfer, and thus require the US to give and India to take more than the other way around. At a timetable decided by the US, the GHAL deal, for example, took more than 13 years after the US had in principle cleared India's access to high-tech transfers. The next big leaps in high-tech co-production, clean energy transitions, semiconductor technology, and artificial intelligence will also go on a case-by-case basis, at an unpredictable pace. The geopolitical context of ties, driven by a desire to counter China, or rein in Russia, is also essentially an American construct, not one followed by India. A quantum leap in US-India ties will then follow, not from exceptions that become the rule, but by a change in the rules themselves, that would transform a series of transactions into a relationship between partners equally respectful of each other's strategic autonomy. Suhasini.h@thehindu.co.in. US-India bilateral ties have grown for the past 25 years due to America's unprecedented exceptions for India, from the nuclear waiver in the 2000s to the transfer of technology. In 2023,